Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today we're talking about some very important changes that are coming out that'll affect the relations between landlords and tenants. So if you're a landlord or if you're renting a commercial property, this is going to affect you. Stay with me. So let's take a look at which leases this new package actually affects. Well, firstly, it's got to affect only commercial leases. Residential leases are dealt with by something completely different. And it also affects only tenants who are eligible for receipt of the JobKeeper program. Finally, it only applies to tenants with a turnover of under $50 million. So if your turnover is over $50 million, skip this video, go back to Netflix. Okay, let's have a look at how this thing is actually going to work in practice. The first principle is that landlords must not terminate leases for non-payment of rent at any time during the coronavirus pandemic period. They're just simply not allowed to do that. The second rule is the one that says that landlords must offer a rent reduction during the pandemic period. Now, that rent reduction is going to be made up of two parts, and it will depend on how much the turnover of the tenant has dropped during the period. So let's take a look at a worked example. Let's consider someone in a commercial tenancy, say a shop, and their turnover has dropped by 40%. The tenant goes to the landlord and said, "My turnover has dropped by 40%, I need a rent reduction." So this is what the landlord must do at a minimum. Firstly, the landlord has to offer a waiver of part of the rent equal to half of the reduction of the turnover. So turnover's gone down by 40%. The landlord simply needs to cut the rent by 20% straight off. The landlord also needs to offer a deferral of another 20%. Now, how long is that rent being deferred for? Well, the answer seems to be until after the end of the pandemic period, and then it needs to be paid back. The question, of course, is how long have you got to pay it back? And the answer is over 2 years. It's got to be 24 months, and that is going to be the case regardless of when the lease ends, even if it ends before that 2-year period. There are various other rules that landlords have to abide by as well as part of this package. One of the first is that landlords are not allowed to charge any interest. They're not allowed to charge additional fees relating to these waivers or deferrals. The next one is that if landlords get the benefit of a reduction in land tax or rates, they have to pass that on to the tenant directly. If the landlord gets the benefit of a loan deferral, let's say the landlord has borrowings against that property, if they get a loan deferral benefit, they're supposed to pass that on as well. Although it's pretty hard to understand how a tenant would actually know how that is working or how much value would be involved in that. We'll have to wait for some specific legislation to find that out. There are some other principles set out in this document as well, and one of them is that there are to be no repayments demanded by landlords until after the end of the COVID-19 pandemic period. Although when that ever is going to be, who exactly knows. The other important one is that landlords are not allowed to take bonds. They're not allowed to call up personal guarantees, and that's critically important for a lot of people with commercial leases. Many of them have given personal guarantees. And if you've given a bank guarantee for a commercial lease, your landlord can't just roll up to the bank and demand that either. For tenants in shopping centres and similar settings, the landlords aren't allowed to charge any penalties for not abiding by the opening hours. This used to be pretty common in the past, but they're not allowed to do that anymore. Okay, now we've heard an awful lot about tenants, but what about the position of landlords? Now, the issue with landlords... That's a totally inappropriate graphic, I'm sorry. Fact of the matter is, most landlords are just mum and dads who've tried to make a go of it. Anyhow, the issue with landlords is that they've got the right to expect that tenants will respect the landlord's ability to pass on additional waivers. So they have the right to demand that tenants will deal with them in good faith just as they have to deal with their tenants in good faith. Now, what about the situations where landlords and tenants, they're not able to come to an agreement? There's still friction between them. Well, it turns out that the state governments are going to be putting together a package to arrange for mediation. One of the other principles is that neither landlord or tenant is going to be allowed to use or exploit the mediation process to just prolong a dispute. The general principle here is that they want these problems dealt with quickly and conclusively. And it seems to me that this is a bit of an outbreak of common sense. I think the government is dealing with this whole situation with commercial tenancies quite well. I think they've struck the balance pretty correctly. But it does rely on people acting together in good faith in difficult situations. So we'll see how that plays out. Anyway, that's today's episode. I hope you got something out of that. Looking forward to catching up with you again in a couple of days. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye for now.